Educated with money, he's well dressed, not funny, and not much.
Hey, we're back for another edition of Education is Fashionable. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Norton. Today, we're going to be talking about how wages are determined. I have 4 learning targets on the schedule for today. We're going to define what a wage is, describe how human capital affects wage rates, and explain why wage rates differ. Describe what the demand for labor is and how wage rates can affect it. We're also going to talk about the supply of labor and how wage rates can affect it. And then we're also going to explain how the demand for labor and supply for labor can cause a change in the equilibrium wage. First thing we're going to do today is take care of learning target 1. Some of the key concepts that you have to know about this particular topic is going to be wages. Now, wages are impacted by the forces of supply and demand, just like the prices of goods and services. So, just think of it. Your wage is how much you're going to be paid for whatever particular job you do. Now, a worker's productivity, how much they can make in an hour, has to be taken into account. And we're talking about make in an hour, we're not talking about how much they make in terms of money. We're talking about the value of the goods and services that they can produce. So one of the keys is that you have to have a lot of human capital. The more human capital you have, the more money you should be able to earn. What human capital is basically your skills. Obviously, someone who's fresh out of high school doesn't have as much human capital as someone who's fresh out of college. So basically, the more skills you have, the greater chance you have of obtaining a higher wage rate. And the more skills you have, the higher value of goods and service you should be able to produce. Let's think of it. Should the fast food worker really make as much in terms of the value of the goods and services as a lawyer? Of course not, because as we can see, in any type of scenario, the fast food worker is making, hamburgers and French fries, where the lawyer is providing a service that costs anywhere from, I've seen lawyers charge as much as $300 or more dollars an hour. So obviously, it takes a lot more skill, a lot more human capital to become a lawyer because of all the training and schooling, where it doesn't take necessarily a whole lot of human capital to become a fast food worker. Other things that can impact how much you get paid is a working condition. So basically, the more unpleasant your working condition is, the higher that you'll be able to get paid, because that's something that the employer has to do. Otherwise, no one's going to come work. Like a garbage man. Garbage men don't get paid an extremely high amount of money, but they're not paid a bad wage rate either. And some of the reason for that is because it's not a desirable job. The smell and working in the elements, in the winter in Michigan, something like that, all of those are taken into account. It doesn't take a lot of skill to take trash cans, empty them, and throw them in the back of a truck. But because of that particular work environment, the employer has no choice but to offer a higher wage rate. Otherwise, no one's going to be willing to do that particular job. Discrimination is also a thing that can impact a wage, and obviously, there's cases of that happen, unfortunately, in society. And some of the ways that discrimination occurs is through race. This type of discrimination is pretty straightforward. A person's not hired simply because of their race. And if they are, they might be paid a lower wage than others just because of their color. Gender is another one. Some employers might pay women less than a man for the same job, despite having the same amount of education and experience. There are debates about how prevalent this is in society, and depending on the politician you listen to, some may find it a widespread issue, and others may argue that it doesn't exist at all. And some individuals make so little at their job that they take on a financial burden associated with increasing their human capital, which basically doesn't allow them to climb the socioeconomic ladder. And we're going to refer to this as occupational discrimination, and it's also known as occupational segregation. More so, the segregation portion, that ties into the idea that only certain types of people should be filling certain jobs, like women or minorities. They might be seen as the only ones who should be taking those jobs. It's hard for me to think of any right now. When we look back in the 1900s, the early to mid, and even, like the 70s and 80s, you might be able to pick out some that are pretty easy to figure out that women were basically stereotyped right into that role, like phone operators. I mean, there are some good paying jobs too that are kind of seen as for women. I even work one. Teaching is one that is long believed to basically be filled by women. Obviously, that has changed over time. Let's see. Discrimination in the case of race, gender, and age also don't hurt just the person who's the employee. It hurts the employer because if, let's say, I didn't like a certain race, and then because of that, I chose to pay people that were that particular skin color a lower wage rate, or I choose to pay women a lower wage rate, and I hire men or people of a preferred skin color instead of those people. But what if the people who I chose to treat poorly are actually better workers? So you can see in this case that discrimination doesn't just hurt the people who are being discriminated against, it also hurts the employer. Not that anyone really feels bad for that person. And I realize I didn't actually talk about the age portion. So age, people can be discriminated based on age too. There might be some people who feel that a person is too old for a job, and there might be some people who think that someone's too young for a job. All right, let's get into the next one. A glass ceiling is another impact. Basically, what a glass ceiling is that you've got the right human capital that's necessary to be promoted, but for some reason, you just never do. It's this unseen barrier that's preventing your advancement. So it's not any really type of discrimination. Maybe it's not really a glass ceiling. Maybe you've got the human capital and you're just a jerk. That could possibly be it, and the person doesn't recognize it. But anytime someone talks about a glass ceiling as far as wage rates, that's what we're going to be discussing. Government action is also something that can impact wage rates. So without government action, the market would determine the wages that people earn, and at times, the government disagrees with the wages that are set by the market and intervenes. And that's when we talk about things like the minimum wage, which is the lowest amount of money that a person can work in 1 hour, or work for in 1 hour. The market might set the equilibrium so low that people could not afford to live working these jobs. It's meant to help people survive that work in these professions. Like, for instance, if you didn't have a minimum wage for fast food workers, I know it seems like I'm picking on fast food workers. They're just the easiest example for you to identify with. But if and plus, it's a minimum wage job, so I have to pick something with minimum wage. So let's say that if you didn't have a minimum wage, the equilibrium, market equilibrium for wages, which we'll get into that later. I mean, market equilibrium is just like how when we talked about market price equilibrium, only this is dealing with wages, obviously. Well, the equilibrium could be like $4, which means that, if we didn't have a minimum wage, people would be working for $4. And if people are already complaining that it's impossible to survive at the current minimum wage, then obviously they certainly wouldn't be able to at the reduced rate. The nice thing is that with a minimum wage is that the people who do work in these professions, they make a little bit more money, and it eases the difficulty as far as survival. Many still argue that you can't really survive on it, but that's not really the point of this lesson, though. So, but one of the negatives, though, is that if wages were lower, the employer could have hired more workers, which means that you could actually have more people who have some sort of money in their pocket. So when you start raising the amount of money that someone has to be paid, then the employer is going to hire less people. And we've talked about that before too. It was one of the common complaints is that if you raise the minimum wage, then what's going to happen is that employers are going to cut back on either hours or employees. Now the federal government has ineffectively increased the minimum wage several times, and some states have even taken it on themselves to increase the minimum wage. So there are two different wage rates. There's a federal minimum wage, and then there's the one your state has. And then you even have some cities or states who don't really go with what's referred to as a minimum wage. They go with what's called a living wage, and those tend to always be higher than what the standard minimum wage is. So investing in yourself is another way that you can impact your wage rate. If you have, the first and third one are pretty much going to go hand in hand. If you have good work habits and you're always being productive, you're going to be more likely to have someone who's your employer eventually go ahead and give you some sort of raise. Staying healthy is a key too, because if you're missing work a lot, there's probably no real incentive to go ahead and pay someone more money because you're not sure how much they'll be around to begin with. And if you're always missing work, you're probably not being a very productive employee either. I know this is probably the toughest one because we can't always stay healthy. It's not always really up to us. I mean, you don't really choose to get sick, but there are certainly some things that you can take on as far as taking care of yourself that might keep you in the workplace instead of at home and being sick. Now, it's time to check for your understanding. At this point, these are the things you should probably be able to do from this at this point in our little video here. Can you describe what a wage is and how productivity plays a role in determining it? Can you explain why something other than skill can influence the wage someone receives? And how can you do your best to make sure that you can get higher wages? So sit there, maybe pause the video, think to yourself for a moment, can I do these three things? Because I covered all of them on the video just now, so if you need to, maybe rewind it, come back, think on it, write your answers down, maybe rewind the video some and check to see if you match up with what was talked about earlier. So when you're ready for that, we can move on to our next learning target, which is going to be describe what the demand for labor is and how wage rates can affect it. So demand for labor is essentially how many workers an employer is willing to hire at any given wage. This works the same way as when we had our lessons dealing with demand. The higher the price that an employer might pay for wages, the less employees they might be willing to hire. So like if this price goes up, demand goes down type thing. This also plays into the theory that gets used in arguments surrounding the increase of the minimum wage that we've actually talked about just now. That if you were to increase it, the employer would get rid of some of the employees they had at the lower wage. So if I could pay someone $5 an hour, I'd be more willing to hire maybe one or two more workers. And since I have to pay you $10 an hour, maybe I get rid of one or two workers. The other thing, too, just on a slightly related topic, is that when wages become too high, in the opinion of the employer, they begin looking to replace their human workers with technological innovations like ordering from a kiosk, and in some cases, looking to effectively implement a robot that cooks and prepares hamburgers. While this technology might be expensive in the short run, the idea is that eventually they will save you money because you won't be paying workers over the stretch of the time that you have these. So, these are real pictures. There are kiosks at McDonald's in certain areas. Not that I've ever come across one where you do all your ordering at a touch screen. And I've seen stories about the one on the right where they got these hamburger making robots, but to the best of my knowledge, there aren't any that are actually in use right now. Probably because they're still in the experimental phase, or at this point, employers feel it's just too expensive. So, let's try this. Can you explain what the demand for labor is? And can you explain how the wage that an employer pays employees impacts the number of workers they can hire? Shouldn't be too hard. We just, it was only 2 slides long, so take some time, see if you can answer that. It'd probably be helpful if you maybe wrote the answers down on paper so that you could come back and review it. And when you're ready, we can move on to learning target 3, which is describe what the supply of labor is and how wage rates can affect it. So the demand for labor references how many workers an employer is willing to hire at a particular wage. I'm sorry, the demand for labor. Maybe I said that. Oh well. So the supply of labor is going to approach that topic from the view of the employee. The supply of labor is essentially how many workers are willing to work for a particular wage regarding that job. The higher the wage, the more people will be interested. I mean, I'm not interested in the garbage man position, but you pay a garbage man $100,000, which they don't. But if you paid a garbage man $100,000, you pique my interest. So, obviously, the higher the money that's offered for a position, the more interest that people have. It's just natural, right? Anyone currently making more than the advertised wage will likely not be interested in applying for the position. Like, I know that from some of the little bit of research I do from time to time, that I make more than a garbage man. So I'm not necessarily interested in becoming a garbage man. And then you have those that are making less than the advertised wage will be likely interested in applying for that position. So if I were, I'm picking on fast food workers again. If I were working at McDonald's and I knew I could get a job as a garbage man, I would probably take it. Of course, I'm not going to enjoy being surrounded by all the garbage smell, but I would be making quite a bit more money. So as far as supply of labor goes, I would be interested in that. And then those currently making the same wage may or may not apply. It probably depends on a set of unknown circumstances. Now, these aren't always absolute. I mean, I can give you an example. The first one I talked about, where anyone making more than the advertised wage will not be interested in applying for the position. That's not always true. I mean, I can talk from personal experience. I actually was making more money at my first teaching job than my second teaching job. So, when I taught at a middle school in Highland Park, I took less money to come to the Chandler Park district. And that might actually go into one of the things that we had discussed earlier when we're talking about work environment. When I worked in Highland Park, they couldn't find people to come in and work there for very long. And, I was there for 1.5 years before I found a place in Chandler Park. And so the only way they could keep people or even lure them in, not that it was worth it for me. I didn't even know what the wage was going to be when I went and interviewed. I was just happy to have a teaching job because it was so tough to find one. So that's how they kept people. I mean, we had people who would show up to work on their first day and leave at lunchtime. So there had to be some way to motivate individuals to stay. So I mean, that was one of the ways that you do it. So, all right. So, can you describe what the supply of labor is and how wage rates can affect it? That should be pretty easy. We only talked about it for about 45 seconds, maybe a minute. Maybe it was a little longer because I decided to reminisce on how terrible my first job was and all the things that were associated with it. But when you're ready, we can get on to our fourth learning target, which is going to be explain how the demand for labor and supply for labor can cause a change in the equilibrium wage. So, an equilibrium wage works in the same manner as when we reviewed how the price of goods and services is determined. When the quantity demanded of labor meets the quantity supplied of labor, we have equilibrium. And that wage, basically, that's associated with that intersecting point is where we find the equilibrium wage. And the same rules apply to from supply and demand for pricing as it does for wage rates. If we have an increase in supply, we end up with lower wages. If we have a decrease in supply, we have higher wages. And then, we can see on there too, an increase in demand, decrease in demand. We have higher wages and lower wages. You don't need me to read to you, even though I just did. All right, and then we have shortages and surpluses occur too. So another recurring theme, shortages and surpluses. We're going to talk about it again. Like I mentioned before, a lot of the things that we've actually learned we're applying here too. And instead of the price of goods and services, we're going to apply it to wages. So in this example, we can see that the wage that was determined by the free market is going to be at W. There's no dollar amount there. It's not a big deal. Make up whatever number you want. It doesn't matter. So if I were to offer a wage higher than W, then I would have a surplus of workers. So one thing to note here too is that I would also have a shortage of demand for labor, and you should be able to figure out why by now. Because, of course, I'm going to have a surplus of workers because you're offering a higher wage if you go above W. And the more that you increase the wage, the more people will want that particular job. And then we also know from our earlier lesson that the higher the wage gets, the less people an employer is willing to basically hire. So I basically have more people willing to work, but I also have employers that don't want to hire as many people because of the higher costs that are associated. So what's bound to happen in this scenario is that the wages would be lowered to meet the equilibrium point. Now, if I were to offer a wage that's below W, then I would have a shortage of supply of labor. I would also have a surplus of demand for labor because of the cheaper costs involved. Oh, you know what? I can pay cheaper wages, so maybe I'll hire a couple more is basically what happens. So essentially what I have is more jobs available, but I can't find enough employees willing to find them. So in this scenario, the employer would not have much of a choice other than to offer a higher wage just so they can fill whatever positions they do have. And the nice thing about this graphic is that it throws in a price floor in the form of a minimum wage, which we can see is put above market equilibrium. So from what we learned in other lessons is this is an effective price floor because I would have to raise my wages. So because the wages are higher than what would normally be determined in the free market, only because of the enforcement of the minimum wage, I have higher paying jobs. But, as we've learned already today, we would have less of them. So that's going to be it for us today. This is our final check for understanding. Can you do these 4 things? I mean, all the activities that we did today for your check for understandings, all built into your learning targets, and these are your learning targets that we had talked about in the beginning of the video. So hopefully you can do all 4. That'll set you up for success in our classroom. And if you can't, obviously you can come back to this anytime you like. So until next time, this is going to be Mr. Norton signing off. Later on.